everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Samantha Genzer, and I'm going to be your host for today. We have a very special episode today. In the first two segments, we have a guest coming on the show. Our guest is Thomas Bresee from the GSMC College Football Podcast. How are you doing today, Thomas?
I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on here.
Yeah, so in the first segment today, we're going to be talking about the House v. NCAA Settlement's effect on women's sports. And then in the next segment, we're going to talk, our guest and I will talk about the Caitlin Clark and the chaos surrounding her in regards to the controversy of her being targeted or not. Afterwards, we're going to be covering the USA volleyball team roster, WTA rankings, and make sure you stay to the end of today's episode to hear about the University of Oklahoma taking their fourth consecutive victory at the World Series. Before we begin, I wanted to ask you guys to like and follow the show and to become a part of our show to tip and donate using the link gsmcpodcast.net. Also, we do get a lot of questions that come from viewers during this show, so to make sure that your questions get read on the air, I ask that you use the link gsmcpodcast.net. This puts your questions at the top of the list so that I see them, and of course, it really does help the show. Again, the link is gsmcpodcast.net. Okay, let's get started. I hope you guys enjoy today's content. Okay, so we're just going to begin with some background information on the House v. NCAA settlement. So this settlement signifies a line in the sand, not since 1984's NCAA v. Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma have we seen a ruling fundamentally alter the landscape of college athletics in this manner. Not only does the settlement distribute roughly $2.8 billion in name, image, and likeness back pay, but it also establishes a framework for future athlete revenue sharing. Details still do need to be sorted out, but it's a landmark step towards getting players in on the financial windfall they generate. The NCAA tournament does benefit from this as it will preserve the tournament, but there are some things that I am concerned about. Non-revenue sports. At most schools, the non-revenue sports are basically everything other than men's football and basketball. It's often women's sports. In addition to potential measures such as staff cuts and delayed facility upgrades, non-revenue sports could be limited. There's a risk of that. And that is a real big risk for schools that are already struggling with financial issues. So, Thomas, I got a question for you before we get into a bunch of the stuff about women's sports and some smaller sports programs. What are your thoughts on the recent NCAA settlement regarding NIL, and how do you think this will impact college football programs?
Yeah, so I'm personally a big fan that we've gotten to this place. I think for a really long time, frankly, a lot of college athletes were kind of getting taken advantage of with the amount of money they were bringing into a university versus the amount they were getting back, which is essentially a scholarship or something along those lines. And it's definitely a step in the right direction, but I feel like I've said it probably a million times on my show at this point, where you answer one big question of how you're going to pay athletes going forward, and I think revenue sharing is a great way to do that, but you probably add 500 more to the plate, and a lot of them surround these smaller sports. But for college football, they've already kind of started to implement some of the different changes, like maybe going to be smaller staffs going forward, maybe a roster cap at 100 players instead of the original 130 right now. So there's some different things going into play for college football in particular, but it's definitely going to impact the smaller sports likely more aggressively, because there's definitely some conferences and some powers that be that are trying to split this a little bit more in favor of the football, men's basketball route than the women's sports or some of the other non-revenue sports, quote unquote.
Yeah, no, I definitely see that. And I do think it's a good thing in the sense that people have gotten, I guess, been taken advantage of just because of the revenue they produced, but also there are a lot of risks. So now moving on towards the topics of women's sports, Thomas, what are your thoughts on, this affecting and impacting women's sports regarding NIL?
Yeah, I think the biggest worry is obviously that you split this. I believe it's $22 million per school that are able to split the revenue sharing among the athletes. And I know that the SEC, I believe Yahoo Sports reported that the SEC was looking at very aggressively pushing this towards football and men's basketball and leaving about 10%, I think, for women's athletics. So that obviously would be a huge problem and something that could cause some financial strain on those programs. And I think it could really help women's sports. If they were to split this down the middle and they were to be able to make sure that the women sports get the same amount as the men's, I think there is a way forward that this could really benefit women's sports and bring it to even more of a forefront than it already is, growing every single day. So I think it's one of those things that until we kind of figure out how it can be implemented and what the kind of breakup is going to be between the men's and women's sports, you don't fully know the impact, but there is definitely a little bit of worry, I think, across the country that some women's sports might be left behind, or these smaller non-revenue sports might be left behind to be competitive in the big-time sports like college football, men's basketball, baseball, the ones that might bring in a little bit of money for the school. So definitely a little bit worried, but there's a lot of things to iron out before I think they really need to be, biting their fingernails or anything crazy like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think that if it was split down right in the middle, that would be awesome, but you have to consider like finances and all of that. Is it possible? I don't know. My biggest fear is that women's sports would just be eliminated from certain schools. Like, for instance, let's take a look at Texas A&M. They're known for academics and sports, huge school, and women's golf is their least profitable sport. They make the least amount of revenue last year in women's golf. There's 9 people on the team and a total of 3 coaches. If women's golf was just cut from Texas A&M, not only would these 3 coaches lose their jobs, but these 9 athletes would lose their scholarships, their passion, commitment to the sport. For some, maybe these athletic scholarships are the only thing that's helping them be able to afford and attend the university. So what are they supposed to do? Just drop out of school? For some people, they're going to school because they play a sport, and for others, they're playing a sport to be able to go to school. So that's just something that I think about a lot. And these issues pretty much apply to smaller sports, which can also be considered non-revenue sports. But in terms of smaller football programs, Thomas, do you believe the revenue sharing model introduced in the settlement will benefit or harm smaller football programs?
Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting question because of that 22 million that can be split up, obviously you can go below that number. So some of these smaller schools might try to opt for that route. They might not be able to pay the full 22 million. In fact, they likely will not be able to pay the full 22 million. So it'll be interesting to see what the gap is between the big dogs, Georgia, Alabama, Texas, the ones that have plenty of money to throw around compared to maybe the group of 5 schools or the FCS smaller programs. And it definitely could hurt them, but also some of the measures that are being put in place, like the roster cap, is a very interesting one to talk about because usually some of these, good players that just wanted to be at a big school would go take a walk-on spot and just try to work their way up a depth chart at a school like Georgia. Now they might not have that opportunity to do that. So they might go to these smaller schools, and maybe those schools become a little bit more talented. And also with the transfer portal being as prevalent as it is, maybe some really talented kids from high school go to those smaller schools and find their way maybe to Power 5 schools later on in their career. So it's one of those things that it is likely going to increase the financial gap between these two entities, the big schools and the smaller football programs. But it also could, lend itself to maybe the talent level being a little bit closer in terms of maybe the star power on a group of 5 team compared to a Power 5 team.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yeah. I think you'll definitely see that gap a little bit more. But also just looking at beyond the immediate effects, how do you foresee the settlement shaping the landscape of college athletics over, let's say, the next decade?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head when we talked about it, or when you said earlier, there is a big fear that some of these smaller sports are going to be eliminated. A lot of these conversations have revolved around college football because it is such a moneymaker, because there is so much power in this sport that they're going to think about it a lot. But I do think that some of the other sports were kind of left behind in some of the discussions, and it could come back to kind of bite those sports later on down the road. And it's obviously kind of a huge problem in college sports in general that college football, college basketball do get preferential treatment because of the financial gap between the two. But I do think there is a reality where everything can stay kind of intact, and we can have, athletic departments that split this evenly and have women's sports come even more to the forefront and have this really just benefit everyone across the board. Now you need a lot of people to get together and make really good decisions to get to that point, and hopefully that happens across the board. Hopefully there's common sense rules that have to be implemented across the country for this, but if not, then it could be a little bit of Wild West where you're trying your hardest to make the football program the best or the basketball program the best, and in that you forget about the non-revenue sports or the women's sports, and some of those get left behind. So definitely a huge worry about the overall college athletics landscape, and maybe a little bit too much focus on college football in these discussions, but it's definitely going to be a case-by-case basis. I think there's a lot of decisions that can be made to make women's sports more than happy with the future of their sports, but also there's the alternative that it gets a little sketchy for those. So definitely kind of a double-edged sword, something that will be kind of up to the decision makers in each athletic department, really.
Yeah, no, I like how you described it, kind of a case-by-case basis. I totally see that. I understand. I hope that in terms of like women's sports, I hope that Title IX can come into effect and more so benefit rather than hurt women's sports at all. I do have one last quick question for you, Thomas. How do you think this settlement will affect the visibility and opportunities for women and men in college athletics?
Yeah, so you just touched on it. I mean, if Title IX is upheld in this and they do have to split it 50-50 down the middle, I think it could help greatly, right? There's more money going towards women's sports. There's more ability for women's athletics to grow and kind of prosper in this new era, especially if you are, taking roster spots and maybe scholarships away from football. You can reallocate those to women's sports or just smaller sports. So I think there is, a path forward where you could get great visibility for women's sports and definitely have the ability to put them on more of a pedestal. There is that worry, obviously, on the other side of it, but I do hope that Title IX is obviously upheld in this scenario, and you can't take a lot of money and allocate it one direction and not leave a lot for everyone else. So I think it could help the visibility, but it's again, kind of up to the decision makers to make sure that happens, really.
Yeah, no, thank you for your input. That was great, Thomas. So that concludes our time for this segment. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next segment where we'll talk about Caitlin Clark. Before we begin, we are going to be taking a very short break, so I will see you guys all very soon.